So, yesterday we talked about, by the way, welcome, glad to have you all with us. We're studying the book of Genesis. Rudy Ross, Bruce Kirby, man, I'm getting ahead of the game here. Yesterday we talked about dreams that were interpreted and fulfilled by Joseph in prison. He's still in prison. And now we find in chapter 41 that he has been in prison for 2 years. And Pharaoh has a dream. He's standing by the Nile. This is chapter 41, verses 1 and 2. And in his dream, he sees 7 sleek and fat cows, and they're grazing on the grass. But then he finds 7 other cows, and they're just the opposite of those sleek cows. They're ugly and they're thin. And the ugly cows eat up the sleek cows. That's verse 4. And then he fell asleep again. And this time he has 7 ears of grain, and they're plump and they're good. But then they have really bad, blighted ears. And the thin ears swallow up the plump ears. And Pharaoh awakes. Verse 8, he tries to get the dream interpreters, and apparently there's a professional class of dream interpreters in Egypt. And they put a lot of stake in those dream interpreters. Can I just pause here? I'm reading a book called On Autocracy, and there are a couple of charlatan, very rich ministers in Africa who are supposed to be prophets and talk about the future. And they're very important other autocrats who give them a lot of money for them to predict the future for them, which, what's old is new, what's new is old. Anyway, with that being said, these in verse 8 we learn these magicians couldn't interpret what was being said. Comment, guys. I've gone off to my political views here for a moment.
Well, God didn't allow them to understand it. And, we're going to read in the next verses that basically the cupbearer remembers, hey, I forgot for the past 2 years that this young man in jail can interpret dreams, so let's find out if he can interpret Pharaoh's dream.
Yeah. Bruce, you have a comment on that?
Well, it's dangerous to serve the Pharaoh. Obviously, the baker messed up the bread and was summarily killed. He wasn't just summarily killed; he was tortured and hung up to dry, quite literally, and so that I would imagine that if I were an interpreter in the court of the Pharaoh, I'd be living the high life, because I could live quite comfortably, and my family could live quite comfortably off the crumbs from the Pharaoh's table.
Yeah.
But let it be known that the Pharaoh has a short fuse, and if my interpretation is bad, then I am in danger. So let me find someone else to bring him bad news and take the heat.
Yeah, that's so true. I have people from time to time, in fact, pretty frequently, come to me and they're going through hard times. And it's like they just can't get out. And I return to this story to think about Joseph being in prison, going through very difficult times. There's an old Texas preacher that I would hear, and he would talk about being broken. And one of his common themes, and I believe it's very true, is before God uses somebody, he allows them to go through a place of breaking so that they know everything they have is from God's hand. And so Joseph is there, and finally 2 years more in prison, cupbearer comes and he says, I know the guy. And so we find then in verse 14 that Pharaoh sends for Joseph. And he says to him in verse 15, I've heard that you can interpret a dream. And Joseph, he puts it very well. It's not I. Only God will give you the right answer.
that the humility of Joseph.
Yeah, absolutely. You talked about his growth. He's certainly there, isn't he? So Joseph gives him the interpretation, and I'm going to skip over to verse 25. He tells him in verse 25 that they're going to have years of plenty, 7, but they're going to be followed by 7 years of famine. He tells him you need to prepare and do it right during these 7 years of plenty, so that when the 7 years of famine, things are going to work well. Comment, guys?
Well, it's basically acting on God's direction.
Right.
And Joseph decides that that the pharaohs should hold back 20%
Right.
of all the crops. And when you do the math on that, it ends up being really over the 7-year period, you're only really gaining 2 years' crops if you do 20%. That's of a normal year's harvest. In the year of the sabbatical year, God promises that, for 2 years, you're still going to be eating what I gave you in the 6th year and the 8th year when this starts. But in the year of Jubilee, basically, there's 3 years of not eating anything in the harvest. So, this all is surrounded by God is the only one that gets growth.
Right.
So, this is a story of his growth, but also, like you were saying, he's using Joseph as a prophet.
Yeah.
So that they would know what is to come. Because it's just not Egypt that will go hungry, it's really the whole Middle East.
Right.
And that's why I wondered, is this a Jubilee harvest every year for 7 years, Father?
Right.
And in some respects, I believe that it was that kind of harvest.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Bruce, you have a thought on that?
No, I think they covered it beautifully.
I'm sorry, I'm operating our camera off of my phone now, and my phone was doing something crazy, but it's all right. So, thank you. Thank you for letting me do that. You see me look at my phone, it's because it operates what we're doing.
So we're talking about the 7 years.
Right.
It's kind of a creation story as well, and then Pharaoh, to some degree, because Joseph has told him that this comes from God, Pharaoh is aligning with this truth that he says about the dream, and he elevates Joseph to being viceroy of Egypt.
Absolutely. And so there's nobody there that can do it but God, and God through Joseph. And so if you I'm going to summarize the next part of this chapter. He puts him as viceroy. That's what Rudy, you just talked about in verse 40. He has him ride in the chariot, it says second command, which is a huge place of honor. And then he gave him a couple, a daughter, and then he had some children. And then I want to talk about the children really quick, or have you do that, which is Manasseh and Ephraim. Just quickly talk about those.
Well, they become, because Joseph is this person of promise, God actually makes him the firstborn of Israel to some degree, and they get an inheritance along with the other 11 brothers. But also in the story, they bend the knee to Joseph.
Yeah.
He begins this ministry, so to speak, as viceroy when he's 30. All of these are images of Jesus. Every knee will bow and tongue confess that he is the Lord, and he begins his ministry at 30 years old as well. So second only to the Father, which Pharaoh is kind of the father image in this. And out that he does have two children, and they're Ephraim and Manasseh, and they are in the tribal count in the property that Israel eventually gets when they come to the land.
That's great. And we end this by saying everybody came to Joseph, as is we're praying for everybody to come to Jesus. Bruce, pray for us, would you?
Lord, thank you for this opportunity to understand the scriptures a little deeper. And there is always the opportunity to reread, revisit, re-worship on our parts, and to make that part of our life, so that when things surround us and feel like they're impinging, that we have the humility and the perseverance to go forward and keep our eyes fixed on you instead of on things that are inconvenient in my life. And in this, I say amen.
Amen. Guys, thank you all so much. Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you for letting me mess with my watch. It was doing something crazy, but it sure is kind of handy on working the camera. God bless you. Take care tomorrow.